Hi, everybody. This is Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. I hope you're doing well. Very pleased to have on the show Dr. Richard Lynn. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Ulster and is the author of several books on the subject of intelligence, including IQ and the Wealth of Nations, the Global Bell Curve, Race Differences in Intelligence and Evolutionary Analysis, and more. It is a challenging conversation to have, but I think one of the most essential conversations to have in the modern world as we wrestle with the challenges of cultural integrations, multiculturalism, and so on. So without any further ado, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Lynn. So, Dr. Lynn, it seems in the mainstream media that with grim regularity, the questions about genetics and IQ and race seem to pop up, and there's this shocked and appalled brigade that screams with great protestation every single time, and they sort of bully people into quietude for, 5 or 10 years, and then it comes up again. Do you think, given the advances in genetic research that are occurring at the moment, that there's any possibility that this grim cycle can be interrupted and people can finally begin to settle down and actually look at the science and the data?
Well, of course, first of all, people are very reluctant to recognize the truths. So you've got a huge emotional barrier to overcome. There are really two questions here. One is the genetic determination of intelligence, and the second is the genetic determination of race differences in intelligence. Now, as far as the genetic determination of intelligence is concerned, this has been well established since the 1930s, and there have been dozens of studies that have shown this. They use twins and adopted children. The twin research shows, for example, that identical twins who are separated at birth or shortly afterwards and brought up in different families, when they're adults, have very similar IQs, despite their environments being different. And the adoption studies show that adopted children, the IQs of adopted children resemble those of their natural parents who they've never seen or hardly ever seen, but they don't resemble that of the adoptive parents. So those are the two principal lines of evidence on this. So as I say, there's really no dispute at all among experts in this subject that intelligence of individuals is very strongly determined by genetics. Now, the second question is whether the race differences in intelligence are also determined to some degree by genetics. And here there's much more dispute and also much more emotional investment in the answer to this question. So it has to be said, I suppose, that first of all, a lot of experts who have opinions, the opinion that genetic factors do play a significant role in the race differences. A lot of experts are in the closet. They won't come out and state this publicly because they put their careers in jeopardy by doing this. But when I talk to people about this, most of them agree that there's some genetic involvement in these race differences. Of course, I should probably just summarize the race differences briefly. There are lots of races, about 7 major races in the world, and they all have different IQs. I don't know whether you want me to elaborate on this, but the major one that's discussed is the difference between blacks and whites. And here I would say that most experts think there's a genetic factor, but a lot of them are not prepared to state this publicly.
And yeah, if you could go into some of the details about the various ethnicities and what IQ testing tells us about potentially some genetic capabilities. I think that would be helpful to the audience who, most people, of course, really try and tiptoe, and I appreciate your courage in taking these issues head on. I try to bring as many facts to the audience as possible, particularly when they're very important for social policies. So, yeah, feel free to go into detail.
Well, of the major races, the rank order of those for intelligence that is measured by intelligence tests is that first of all, the most intelligent peoples are the Jews. These are the two kinds of Jews: the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the European Jews, those who dwelt in Europe for many, many centuries, and many of whom immigrated to the United States. They are almost entirely Ashkenazi European Jews. These have an IQ of around 110. But the second group of Jews are the so-called Oriental Jews, who lived for many centuries in North Africa and in the Middle East, principally in Iraq. These have a rather substantially lower IQ, about 95. And Israel has about half of Jews in Israel are Ashkenazi Jews, and the other half are these Oriental Jews. And there's a divided society there between these two groups, almost like the divided society in the United States between blacks and whites, and in some other countries like Britain, for which I'm speaking now. But very few people in Israel will come out and say that there's an IQ difference between these two groups. There are substantial differences in how well they do in schools and in the job market, and these are related to their IQ differences, just as there are between the races in other countries. But as I say, no one in Israel is willing to come out and say this. So political correctness is everywhere. Well, not quite everywhere. Not in Russia or China or Japan, but throughout the Western world. Well, now, after the Ashkenazi Jews come the Northeast Asian peoples of China and Japan and Korea, and these have an IQ to 105. These IQs are all calibrated against 100 for Europeans. And this is why these people do so well in the United States. It's very well known that these ethnic Chinese, particularly, also ethnic Koreans and Japanese, do very well in the educational system and in the job market. Then come the Europeans, who we set with an IQ of 100. Now, then below them come the North Africans and the South Asians, running from the Near East, Lebanon and Turkey and so forth, right through India to Southeast Asia. These have an IQ of about 85. And then below these come the Sub-Saharan Africans, who in Sub-Saharan Africa have an IQ of about 70. Blacks in the United States have an IQ of around 85. And the reason that's higher is partly because they have some white admixture. Most blacks in the United States have some percentage of white ancestry, which raises their IQs. So they also have the advantages of living in an affluent society created by whites. And then below these come the Australian Aborigines, who have an IQ of 62. And their IQ expresses itself in their very poor performance in Australian society, and very poorly in the school system and in the job market. So that summarizes the IQs of the major races. Of course, as I was saying, the major focus of interest has been on the black-white differences But I think it's quite likely that all these differences have some genetic components, because wherever you find them outside their local habitats, there aren't many Australian Aborigines outside their local habitats, of course, but most of them outside their local habitats do equally well as they do in their native lands. Blacks who have lower IQs in sub-Saharan Africa do poorly in the United States and in Canada and in Brazil and in Europe. Northeast Asians, the Chinese and Japanese and so forth, they do well wherever they are, in Brazil, in the United States, Canada, and again in Europe. So these differences do not seem to be affected by the environment in which these peoples live. The differences seem to emerge whenever they are.
Sorry to interrupt you, if I could just ask a quick question, because, of course, I have a lot of American listeners, and one of the big questions in America is compatibility, cultural or intelligence-wise, between, and I know it's not technically a race, what are called the Hispanics or the mestizos with European admixture. Where do the Mexicans and Central or Southern Americans fit into this hierarchy?
They come about halfway between the blacks and the whites. The Native American Indians are a bit of a mixed lot, of course, genetically. Hispanics are rather a mixed lot. It's really a cultural category rather than a genetic category. Some Hispanics are pure Europeans, many of them coming from Cuba. Many of them are mestizos, that's to say mixed race Europeans and Native American Indians. And then again, many of them are Native American Indians. They're all if they come from Mexico or from Latin America, they're categorized as Hispanics, but they're racially, some of them, quite a lot of them, are pure Native American Indians. So you get rather a big spread according to the genetic heritage of these peoples.
Right. Now, everybody's big hope, of course, it would be a way of narrowing these gaps in intelligence so that it would be more of an even playing field, at least in a free market environment. I know you've done some work talking about the degree to which better nutrition has done something to help close these gaps, but as far as I understand it, there are some limitations on what can be achieved through nutrition alone. I wonder if you could help people understand what has been done and how far it may be able to go.
Well, nutrition is probably the major environmental factor that affects intelligence. Many people think that the major environmental factor is things like schooling and the kind of family you're reared in, but the evidence really points to nutritional differences, particularly of the unborn child, the nutrition it receives from its mother, and then in the early years of infancy. Well, undoubtedly the low IQ in Africa, as compared with the higher IQ of blacks in the United States and Canada and Britain, undoubtedly the lower IQ in Africa is to a substantial extent a result of the poor nutrition. So if the nutrition could be increased in sub-Saharan Africa, undoubtedly the IQs would rise. And they might rise to something like around 80 or so. They probably wouldn't rise to the extent that to the 85 of African Americans, because African Americans have other advantages, better health care, for example, but they also have some white admixture. But you'd probably raise their IQs in sub-Saharan Africa by around 10 IQ points if all Africans could be provided with optimum nutrition, which would, of course, be a difficult thing to do in practice.
Right. Now, income disparity is something that, particularly on the left, there seems to be a lot of complaints about, and you've also pointed out that IQ in Japan and in the United States shows a growing disparity, and I wonder if you could help people understand the degree to which IQ and income show some fairly significant positive correlations, and how a growing disparity in income may potentially reflect a growing disparity in IQ distribution.
Well, IQ is certainly a significant determinant of people's income. And this is shown by studies which measure IQs in children, say of 8-year-olds, and then the sample is followed up and their incomes can be measured in middle age. And your IQ at the age of 8 does undoubtedly predict, to some degree, your income many decades later. And this has also been shown in pairs of brothers. Typically, pairs of brothers and pairs of sisters born in the same family do not have the same IQ, as is a matter of everyday experience, which all your listeners will be familiar with. Typically, one sibling is more intelligent than the other. Now, when these are followed up again in middle age, the sibling with the higher IQ in infancy does have a higher income in middle age. This is a particularly useful form of study because it controls for all the other family environmental possible influences, like how much advantages parents may give to their children, and examples and that sort of thing. However, all that said, intelligence is only a modest predictor of income. Your income in middle age is determined by other factors, particularly your motivation, how hard you work, how much you value money, and also by luck. To some quite significant extent, your income can be determined just by the luck. You might, for example, marry the boss's daughter. He might give you a high income job, which he wouldn't have given you if you hadn't married his daughter. Or you can just be in the right place at the right time. So, as I say, to recapitulate, that said, intelligence is a determinant of income, but not by any means a sole determinant.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly do want to push back. When I first began to explore the realm of IQ and genetics and so on, it can be a risk to fall into determinism. You know, like your brain circumference is your destiny. And of course, we really want to point out to people that individual willpower, choices, abilities, social circles, personal choices all have a big effect on the success of your life. And that's not just a factor of intelligence. Now, one of the things that was most surprising to me when I began looking at this information, Dr. Lynn, was the degree to which, within the sort of normal, reasonably wealthy, reasonably well-adjusted households in North America and in Western Europe, the degree to which environment does not, and certainly in the long term, does not seem to have much effect on intelligence was really surprising to me. And I wonder if you could help people understand how it tends to fall away. Your environment tends to fall away as a predictor of particular characteristics as you go further through life.
Well, what you say is correct, that the environment has a greater effect on children's intelligence than it does as they grow older, on adult intelligence. Well, probably the reason for that is that parents are a very major influence on a child. But as the child grows into adolescence and then becomes an adult, the influence of their parents lessens, and they kind of reach their own level. And so the genetic factors become more and more important as they get older. Particularly we calculate these heritabilities in quantitatively on a scale running from 0 to 1. So the heritability of children about the age of 5 is only about 4% or zero point 0.4, whereas the heritability of intelligence among adults is approximately 0.8. So you see you get a doubling of the hereditary effect over the span from early childhood to adults.
Right. Now, a question that I get a lot when I'm talking about intelligence and IQ tests is the relationship between the specific categories of intelligence testings, things like spatial relations, vocabulary, reaction time, filling in missing pictures, and so on, which, at least from what I've read among certain ethnicities, are not evenly distributed. Ashkenazi Jews tend to do better on verbal skills, and Chinese and Japanese and Koreans and so on tend to do better on visual spatial. But then underlying all of this is the magic letter G, which is kind of confusing to people, and I wonder if you could help people understand what the intelligence tests are trying to get at by taking these different approaches and measuring these different specific skill sets.
Well, G stands for general, the general factor. So intelligence seems to be composed of, first of all, of G, which is a general factor which enters into any kind of mental task, such as those you mentioned, your verbal abilities expressed in your vocabulary, your spatial abilities expressed in how well you can play chess, for example, your general reasoning abilities, solving logical puzzles. It seems, therefore, there is some general power of the brain which affects how you perform, better or worse, in anything that's undertaken. So that's one part of it. However, in addition to these, there are what are often called specific factors, like those you mentioned, and others as well, such as, say, memory. So that you could have, say, an average G, but you might have a very good verbal abilities, or you might have a very poor verbal ability, or you could have a very good spatial ability, or a very poor one. But some of these rather exceptional people in that regard have particular labels attached to them. For example, autistic individuals often have very poor verbal abilities, not particularly good G, but they can be very good at spatial abilities. So you do get those kinds of patterns. So I hope I've explained this to the best of my ability. You have these two factors, as I say, the general factor that enters into everything, but then above these are specific ones which can be quite pronounced and idiosyncratic to individuals. Probably, for example, Einstein is an interesting example. Einstein was quite poor at verbal abilities. He was extremely good at spatial abilities. He could visualize what objects would be like. If you were in a space capsule going next to an object in space, you could visualize how it would go, but he couldn't pass the verbal abilities into the University of Zurich, the verbal test, because his verbal abilities weren't at all well developed. So this is the instance of these kind of idiosyncratic pattern that can vary a lot between individuals.
Right. Now, I've heard a variety of theories as to why particular ethnicities may have ended up with the different average levels of intelligence, at least the kind of intelligence measured by an IQ test. Do you have a theory or approach that you're somewhat partial to? And again, I know this stuff is very tough to prove in some sort of objective empirical sense, but is there any explanation that you have found more compelling than others when it comes to explaining ethnic differences in IQ?
Well, my theory that I've advanced about 30 years ago, and have continued to advance, is that these differences developed in response to the kind of environmental and climatic environments in which the races evolved. The human race evolved in Africa, around the equator, in East Africa and present-day Kenya and Uganda. The human race is thought to evolve somewhere around 100,000 years ago. And some of these people migrated northwards. First of all, they migrated into North Africa and into the Middle East, the area around contemporary Israel, and then they migrated further. Some of them went up into Europe, some of them went into South Asia, across into India, and then down into Australia, and some that went north of the Himalayas into contemporary China and Japan. Well, now, as they went northwards, the climates got more and more severe. They got colder, and this was intellectually challenging. You had to be brighter in order to survive in these colder environments. Part of the problem was that in equatorial Africa there were food supplies from fruits and nuts and insects all year round. It's not particularly intellectually demanding to collect these and eat them. But as these people moved northwards, food supplies became seasonal. There were no plant foods available in the winter and spring. They only became available in summer and into autumn. So in those more northerly latitudes, peoples had to rely on hunting animals for their food supply. And that's more intellectually demanding than simply going out and picking a banana off a tree, obviously. Hunting animals for food is quite an intellectually demanding task. These animals that are hunted, like sort of deer and horses and animals of that kind, obviously these animals can run fast. And in order to capture them and kill them, people had to use their brains and devise various methods, finding traps, hunting in groups so that they could be driven into, say, loops of rivers or in ravines or natural obstacles of that kind. So, therefore, thus you get this gradient of climate and intelligence. The more northerly the environments in which these people evolved, the more intelligent they became. Hence, you get this gradient, which I described earlier. As you get a bit more north of the equator into North Africa, the IQs rise. And then as you get into Europe and into Northeast Asia, the IQs go higher still. So you get a completely a linear relationship between the severity of the climate in which these peoples evolved, these races evolved, and their IQs.
And where would the Inuit, or I guess what used to be called the Eskimos, fit into, because they would be under a very harsh climate, but I don't think that they run particularly stellar in terms of IQ.
Well, that is correct. So this is a slight anomaly, or an anomaly for the theory. Now, probably the explanation for this is that there have never been very many Eskimos numerically. I think today there are about 250,000 of them, whereas of course in China there are 1.2 billion, and you can add another 1.5 million for Japanese and Koreans. Now, during the course of the evolution of intelligence in these different localities, what would have happened is that new genes would have appeared as mutations. As the races evolved, they changed genetically as a result of mutations. One of the most obvious effects of these is that people's skins turned white, of course. We were all originally black when 100,000 years ago, when our ancestors were in Africa. But as people evolved, people migrated northwards, their skins grew paler. To some degree paler in North Africa and in South Asia, and paler still in Europe and in Northeast Asia. Well, this was a result of new genes appearing through mutation and being advantageous, spreading in the population till eventually in Europe everyone became white. Well, now the same thing seems to must have happened with intelligence, that new genes for intelligence must have appeared through mutation. Now, if you're a very small population like the Eskimos, the chance of an advantageous mutation appearing is quite low. Obviously, the chance of an advantageous mutation appearing will depend on the size of the population. These new mutations just crop up by chance. So if you have a huge population like that of the Chinese, you're quite likely to get an advantageous new mutation. But if you have a tiny population up in Alaska and northeast Siberia, where only got less than 1 million Eskimos or Inuit, the chance of an advantageous mutation appearing is much lower. So that must be the explanation for this, that the advantageous mutations for higher intelligence just didn't appear in the Inuit, as we know, formerly known as the Eskimos, but now known as the Inuit.
It has also struck me that in Europe in particular, when you have agriculture, somebody who's a better, smarter farmer, and there's at least some free market in land, the smarter farmer is going to end up with more land because he's going to be able to outbid other people because he can make more productive uses of the land. And as a result, he's going to end with more resources and he's going to be able to have more kids. And so it seems that, to me, where there's an agriculture in some form of the free market, there's a very positive reinforcement for higher intelligence. And I think the argument has been made with regards to the Ashkenazi Jews that who were not considered to be very intelligent in antiquity, but over the last 700 years have really focused on, the smartest people, who are the rabbis, who can master a bunch of languages and so on, having more children and being very much respected at the same time when the Catholic Church was essentially neutering the smartest Europeans. And I think sort of when the climate gets so harsh, I don't think that, well, you're right, of course, there won't be as many mutations, but I also think that the more intelligent mutations don't end up with a correspondingly greater share of society's resources that would help the spread biologically and reproductively of that mutation.
Well, I agree with all you say there. Of course, as you rightly say, to pick up one of the points, the Roman Catholic Church over the last 2,000 years or so has been a negative influence as far as intelligence is concerned because of the rule of clerical celibacy, although not always observed in practice, but nevertheless would have been broadly what is called a dysgenic effect, i.e. not an effect of depressing the IQ. And this does stand in contrast, as you rightly pointed out, with the Ashkenazi Jews, where rabbis, equivalent of priests in Christendom, rabbis were always permitted to marry and were indeed sought after as desirable marriage partners. So this is almost certainly one of the factors responsible for the high IQ of the Ashkenazi Jews, which we observe today.
One other aspect that, again, I know we're sort of right at the edge of anything that genetics can explain, but one of the things that has been often remarked on in my studies in history is this peculiar restless fertility of Western European civilization with regards to some of the great advantages that civilization enjoys around the world, things like, the invention of logic, the scientific revolution, the free market, limited government. A lot of these things, well, most of these revolutions came out of sort of Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian tradition in Western Europe. Do you know if anyone's working on, or I've heard some arguments around prevalence of testosterone and so on, as sort of the right balance between the East Asians and the blacks and so on with the Europeans, but have you heard of anyone who's working on if there's any reason outside of culture, which is not usually much of an answer, as to why Western Europeans seem to have had that restless intellectual fertility throughout good chunks of their history?
Well, psychologists have this concept of collectivism and individualism applied to cultures. And according to this concept, European peoples tend to be individualistic, and Northeast Asian peoples tend to be collectivist. The result of their collectivism is, the high collectivism, is that they're rather conformist. When they find it, because they're so conformist, they find it a bit hard to think outside the box. I think this is the right kind of approach to this question, which, as you rightly say, European peoples have had a better track record of really high-level creative achievement. For example, if you look at Nobel Prizes for science, the vast majority of them have been won by Europeans, by which I mean European peoples in the States, of course, including Jews, as well as those in Europe. And there have been about something like 700 Nobel Prizes for the sciences since they were first introduced in 1901. And only a handful of these, I think probably about a dozen or so off the cuff, have been won by Orientals. This is a kind of a particular exemplification of the point you made, that although they have high IQs in Northeast Asia, they do seem to be they're less good than Europeans at really high-level creative achievement. I think there's a sort of fear of kind of anxiety about being, standing out and taking a different view from the majority. To achieve these very high-level creative innovations, you have to sort of take the view that everyone else has been wrong, and that you have got the right answer to these things, to this particular problem. Like, obviously, examples, people like Darwin, sometimes, or Galileo, sometimes, people who have these very high-level achievements, they run up against a lot of prejudice and hostility to presenting these views, but nevertheless, European peoples have more courage to enable them to do this, and Oriental peoples seem to be more timid and anxious about dissenting from the majority and received view. I think they have the saying in China, the nail that stands out gets hammered down. It's sort of exemplification of this apprehension that these people have about presenting an original theory or set of facts that run counter to received opinion. Possibly the explanation for this is that Northeast Asia was a harsher environment than that of Europe when people evolved, and there would have been greater pressure for conformity in order to survive in that harsh environment. People would have had to have been very highly cooperative with each other, and that would have been a sort of selection pressure for conforming to the way the group behaved. That is the way I would approach this problem.
And it is a very strange thing to imagine, for a lot of people, myself included, that cultural preferences, emotional makeups, and so on may be genetically selected, particularly, as you say, for the need to cooperate in harsh environments. It is a pretty wild idea, and I strongly encourage people to keep pursuing this. And again, this doesn't mean that there can't be all these kinds of exceptions to these general trends. This is, for me, this information is the most useful, never particularly when looking at individuals, but when looking at larger social trends. Now, I guess the last question that I have, Dr. Lynn, is where is the information, or where does the data point at the moment between the genders, which of course is the other big fault line around which society is currently wrestling in terms of outcome disparities, at least in the free market. So where does the data point in terms of any potential differences between men and women?
Well, this is another very contentious subject, as you rightly say, hardly less contentious than the race difference. And in my opinion, my theory of this is that the sexes do not differ much on intelligence up to the age of 15, except that boys do have better spatial abilities. But if you take general verbal vocabulary size, verbal abilities, reasoning abilities, the sexes are the same up to about 15. But from the age of 16 onwards, boys continue to grow, whereas the growth of girls stabilizes. And I'm talking about physical growth now. But this also seems to apply to mental growth. And the IQ of boys increases. And their general IQ rises to about a 4 IQ point advantage when boys become adults. So, as I was saying a little bit earlier, the IQ difference between blacks and whites in the United States is about 15 IQ points. So in relation to that, as I say, the IQ difference between men and women is about 4 IQ points, so therefore something like around a quarter of the black-white difference. So this is my opinion. In my opinion, these are the facts of the matter. They are probably even less accepted among, they're less accepted among experts in the field than the race difference, because they haven't been examined quite so much. But I believe that this is the fact. And I think this undoubtedly explains why there are very few women at the top of anything, by which I mean Nobel Prize winners and professors at Harvard, High Court, Supreme Court judges, CEOs of big companies, any jobs which are highly intellectually demanding have only small minorities of women holding them. Of course, there is another reason for this, which is that many women are less motivated for high-level achievement than men. To become a high-level achiever in any of these fields, you have to be very highly motivated and devote an enormous amount of energy to it. And many women prefer to devote their energies to homemaking and rearing children and looking after their families. So that is undoubtedly another reason, but in my opinion, the IQ difference between men and women is a major factor why men predominate at the top of virtually all occupations.
Right, and the 4 IQ point difference that you mentioned, to a lot of people would not be enough to sort of exclude women to some degree from the very highest levels of achievement. But from what I understand as well, women tend to be more of a vertical column when it comes to the IQ distribution. They tend to be clustered a little bit more around the mean, and they're a little bit less at the extremes of either very high or relatively low intellectual ability, whereas men, the bell curve is like less of a column and more of a sort of sand dune, in that they tend to be more highly represented at the higher levels of intellectual achievement, for which we can say yay, but also at the lower levels of intellectual achievement they tend to be overrepresented, which is why there are more homeless men and more men who end up with, Pulitzer Prizes and other kinds of awards for high intellectual achievement. And that, I would imagine, if that disparity is valid, then that would also show up a little bit later on in life.
Yes. What you say, that is also true. The range of intelligence is greater than among men. I think this was first pointed out by Havelock Ellis in the first decade of the 20th century, but has been shown in many subsequent studies.
Right. And do you think that there is enough work occurring on sort of the Human Genome Project? I mean, it would be wonderful. And when I say wonderful, it's not that you welcome massive disparities between groups, but as far as having an understanding is always the first step to solving a problem. Do you think that there's enough work occurring in the realm of human genetics at the moment that, people, of course, push back and say, well, there's no gene for intelligence, but I don't know what that means. There's no gene for height either. It's a complex interaction of probably, 500 to 1,000 genes. But do you think that there's enough work occurring in this area among genetic scientists that we may end up with any kind of answer, or are they being driven out of this particular area of research by the socially contentious nature of it?
I think geneticists will find these genes and the answer to these questions in due course. You may know Jim Watson, who was famously fired from or forced to resign from his presidency at the Cold Harbor Research Station a few years ago, about 8 or so years ago, for saying that the blacks are less intelligent than whites. He ends his autobiography by saying, probably around 10 or 15 years ago, in time, geneticists will produce the answer to this question. The time scale, of course, is difficult to guess, but I don't think there's any doubt that the answers will be found in due course.
Let's hope so. And I wonder if you could share with my listeners any of your upcoming projects that you may be working on that they can look forward to seeing.
Well, I just finished a book on race differences in psychopathic personality, which I think is just as important as race differences in intelligence, but have been very rarely discussed. The psychopathic personality is the personality which is lacking in a moral sense, and therefore expresses itself in behaviors like crime and general dishonesty and the neglect of the moral values of society. And I've put together a lot of evidence on this and concluded that the race differences in psychopathic personality run in parallel with the race differences in intelligence, but in reverse, as it were. That is to say, the most psychopathic people are the Australian Aborigines, and then the blacks are fairly psychopathic. That is expressed in most notably in their very high rates of crime, as I'm sure your listeners will be aware. Blacks in the United States are imprisoned for crime approximately 7 times more than whites in relation to their numbers in the population, and we have exactly the same high crime rates of crime in Britain. And so forth with these other races. So the Oriental peoples of China and Japan are the least psychopathic. They're known in the States as the model minority because they have such they behave so well in society with their low rates of crime, their high application in education and in employment. So I finished this book, and my publisher is working on producing it.
And that's very interesting because we did a presentation late last year on the factors that are driving criminality, particularly in the United States, and we did talk about some genetics and some race differences. I actually did try and find some information about categories of mental illnesses that may have been rooted in ethnic differences, and I really wasn't able to find much of anything, so I couldn't put that part in. So I certainly look forward to this book with great interest, and we'll do what we can to help publicize it, because again, this is just another part of the puzzle of trying to figure out what is going on in society without reaching for the racism card, because that, I think, is getting to be a bit of a tired trope, and clearly, although it's been relentlessly applied for the last few generations, has not done a huge amount to solve particular problems in society. And when problems prove intractable, to me, it's always because people have the wrong basic assumptions. So I find that quite fascinating. I look forward to reading it. Do you have a title as yet?
It's called Race Differences in Psychopathic Personality.
All right.
And
Good. Well, that's pretty clear.
Published by Richard Spencer for the Washington Summit Publishers. I don't know whether you know this outfit.
No, but we'll put links as soon as it comes out. Please let us know, and we'll put links where we can to help get people towards this information, which I'm sure would be helpful. Where did the Jews score in terms of psychopathy?
Well, more around the average European. The Europeans are more psychopathic than Northeast Asians. So I wouldn't say that I was wholly free of psychopathic personality. So I'd say I'd admit to having a touch of it, if I can put it like that.
Well, ignoring social norms is, of course, a double-edged sword, and all the people who rebel against existing structures and really define progress have to have the capacity to ignore the social cues of everyone around them telling them not to, particularly could just be entrenched economic interests. So the ability to reject social norms is sort of necessary for progress in society, but at the same time it is a double-edged sword, because you can, of course, also ignore ethical norms around basic decent behavior, which is not what we want from anyone, even the innovators.
What you say is entirely true. I remember asking Arthur Jensen, who I'm sure is well known to you, as sort of a person who was out in front on the race differences in intelligence and their genetic basis when he came out on this in the late 60s. I remember asking him once why it was that why did he, as it were, stand up and be counted on this issue while so many people who took the same view were keeping a low profile. And he said, well, I think it's because I don't really mind being disliked by other people. This is a sort of feature of people who have a touch of psychopathic personality, that you lack the sense, you have to be, I think I'm echoing your own observations, where you have to be, to some degree, immune from fear of being disliked. I mean, a lot of people, Darwin was an interesting example. He was there, you know, he realized that when eventually he was going to publish his Origin of Species, he was going to get a tremendous amount of hatred. And he postponed it for many years until this fellow Alfred Wallace produced the same theory and sent him the paper. And so he thought, well, I've got to get this out before Wallace gets all the credit. So he was really sort of prodded by Wallace. But it's understandable that, you know, if you produce these theories, Galileo had the same problem, of course, when he was threatened with being burned by the Vatican in Rome in the early 17th century. If you do stick your neck out on these issues, which are very contrary to received opinion, you do come in for a lot of flack. And you have to have a certain degree of insensitivity, which is associated with some degree of psychopathic personality, in order to come out and go public on these issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, it has often struck me, of course, that the people who I admire most in history were almost always intensely despised by their contemporaries. But when you add enough time, people turn from annoyances to heroes, and you have to be able to look at the long view of not where your status is in the present, but to some degree take comfort in the long-term view, which may, of course, arrive long after your death, but which the wise understand, you know, that we wish to be admired by the standards of the future, not praised by the usually lower standards of the present.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lynn. It was a great pleasure to chat with you. We'll put, of course, a link to your website where people can read more of your work. Appreciate, of course, the stand that you've taken for many years, and appreciate the fact that, of course, you've had to have some outrageous slings and arrows, like most people who tell difficult truths to a challenging world. I appreciate the stand that you've taken, and I hope we can chat again.
Right. Thank you. Be nice to talk to you. Bye-bye for now.
All the best.